I would say that I've always been invested in forms of materialist analysis, as well as in forms of critical engagement that marshal intellectual tools for social transformation. But I also came up in a world that we could refer to as the belly of the beast, meaning the heart of the US empire, and did my early training in the 1990s. And so if you were in the 90s like me looking for radical theory, what was on offer was French theory and German-style critical theory. And that's what I was drawn to, because everyone around me was saying, well, this stuff is really changing the nature of the conversation, it is profoundly radical, you need to know these things. And so one of the elements they think that we'll get into in the conversation is that what I didn't know then, but that I now see very clearly retrospectively, is what I refer to as the intellectual apparatus. And this is drawing on the work of Brecht and many others. It's not like some concept I invented myself. It's part of a collective tradition of critique. And the intellectual apparatus is the entire system of intellectual production. So everything that goes into the production of ideas. This is universities, think tanks, the media, mass culture, so-called high culture, etc. But also the entire system of circulation. What ideas become part of the public sphere, circulate widely, are translated into other languages, what ideas are not circulated widely, and also consumption. Right? Because there's a system of pre-programmed consumption that means that certain ideas are those, like myself, growing up in rural Kansas, was apt to consume because it was what was on offer. And so when I came to Paris I came in the mid-90s, and it was really the tail end of the grand era of French theory, and I began studying with Luca Rigori, then I did my master's with Jacques Derrida here at this institution, and then kind of went and took classes with anybody that I could who was really famous in what I now understand is the global theory industry. Kristeva, Cixous, Paul Ricoeur, Lyotard, Laruelle, then I discovered Alain Badiou and Jacques Rancière. I ended up doing my dissertation with Badiou. And so I kind of just dove wholeheartedly into these traditions. And one of the things that I realized, given my dedication to materialist modes of analysis, is that first, I felt very insecure and that I needed to train myself in a whole series of things. And so I learned all the languages that I needed, and I thought, well, Derrida is the most prominent thinker, so I need to know Greek, I need to know Latin, I need to know German, I need to know French, and I need to know English. And so I taught myself those languages, and I dove into as well, not just his work, but then all of the work that he was reading. So the kind of canonical history of Western philosophy. And in doing that, I discovered that there were unspoken parameters to his theoretical practice. And so another key notion for me is a theoretical practice. I'm interested not simply in what people say or their ideas, but in their material practice qua intellectual. Not what they say they do, but what they actually do. And what Derrida actually does, I realized, and it ended up becoming both my dissertation and my first book, is he operates within a historically constituted intellectual practice that I would now refer to as bourgeois philosophy. And in bourgeois philosophy, what you do is you focus on a specific object of analysis, the canonized texts of the Western tradition. You concentrate on the quote-unquote genius producers of those intellectual products, so, you know, Leibniz and Kant and people like that. And thirdly, you engage in internal analysis, right? One of Derrida's most famous claims is that you can never analyze the context until you've exhausted the text, but the text is inexhaustible, so you never have to deal with the context, right? Both Foucault and Rancière really do, it's also a kind of pseudo-materialism, because when you compare what it is they're analyzing to their framework of analysis is highly idiosyncratic, right? And so my engagement with both of these thinkers wasn't just reading what they wrote, it was reading all the things that they wrote, or that they were reading, and then comparing them to other analysts of the same topics. And finding that, well, that's really strange that, you know, someone like Foucault would say that, well, there's no longer these like horrific displays of corporeal punishment anymore. Like, this is in an age of Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib. Like, what planet are you on? And lynchings, and like, just look at the history of the United States. Like, you can't just make these massive transcendental demarcations and act as if, you know, this idiosyncratic version of history mapped onto actual material history. And so by comparing and contrasting their transcendental accounts of history to other material accounts of history, I recognized that they were highly limiting, and that also they were largely premised on trying to come up with some like absolutely new and individual understanding of the world that no one had arrived at before. And one of the powers of the historical materialist tradition is that that's not how it works. Like, one individual doesn't rise above everyone else as a saintly figure and bestow upon humanity the gospel. No, people work together to figure things out, and we have more brain power when we work together. And it's a collective tradition of elucidation, right? And so that idiosyncratic nature, I think, it also is just part of their brand management, because ultimately what they wanted to do was to ratchet up their symbolic capital within the global theory industry. And you don't do that by working with others and by developing modes of analysis that are collective. You do that by saying, everyone else is wrong. Here's my new concept. Here's my new idea of the 19th century. And I find that now, in retrospect, to be not only problematic, but ultimately to be a product of how commodified intellectual production operates under the global theory industry. And I should probably have said, I've trafficked in this myself, like, mea culpa. For sure. There's plenty of my own writings where I look back at them and cringe and think, oh, that neologism doesn't really explain anything. It's not helpful. It's just me trying to wave my hands and look, more impressive than somebody else. So I probably should have led with that, because my own critiques, I think the beginning points of all of my own critiques were self-critique. And when 9/11 happened and the political stuff that I was talking about earlier, actually that was the worst. It wasn't as bad that Derrida couldn't explain it. It was that people were asking me, you're this sophisticated Parisian intellectual, what's going on here? And I was like, well, I don't know, différence. That's about all I had. It was pretty embarrassing. And so the motivation for a lot of this critical orientation was really a self-critique and realizing that I didn't have the tools that were necessary to understand what's going on. The dominant understanding of the Central Intelligence Agency is mediated by the Central Intelligence Agency. I have a quick quote here, or quick notes here. So 1,947 screen products, TV shows and movies, have been supported by the Department of Defense. And 114 screen products have been supported by the OSS, CIA, FBI, including, for one screen product, these are long-running TV shows like 24, Homeland, etc. So the James Bond film, Mission Impossible, there's a lot of great scholarship on this, but National Security Cinema is one of the solid books on this. And so what they've done is they've created the image of themselves so that people are confused about how they actually operate. This is important because the Central Intelligence Agency and it came out of the Office of Strategic Services, which was the wartime intelligence service, and of course a deeper history of MI6 in Great Britain, who they learned from and then incorporated and collaborated with. The Central Intelligence Agency, they largely two branches that are important. One branch that has been widely studied and understood, Killing Hope by William Bloom is one of the best books on the topic, is the death arm, right? The Central Intelligence Agency has been responsible for killing a minimum of 6 million people worldwide between 1947 and 1987, according to 14 former members of the Central Intelligence Agency who did a study in the late 1980s. So there's that element of all of the coup d'etat, destabilization efforts, etc., overthrowing a minimum, or attempting to overthrow 50 foreign governments, the majority of which were democratically elected, since World War II alone, right? But the other element that is unbelievably important and understudied, and it's one of the reasons that I got interested in it, is research and analysis. The OSS, the predecessor organization of the CIA, had set up a research and analysis branch. The numbers vary depending on who you look at, but between about 1,200 and 2,000 full-time researchers were working for the OSS. And this was the model for the Central Intelligence Agency. They actually recruited an innumerable number of university professors, particularly from the Ivy Leagues and the elite institutions, to do research and analysis globally. This is a big part of what they do. In fact, according to two analysts that I know, the OSS research and analysis branch was the largest think tank or largest grouping of researchers in the history of the United States and set the agenda for post-war American social science, right? And the people involved in the OSS, there's many of them, right? Herbert Marcuse, Franz Neumann, a lot of the leading luminaries of the kind of post-war social sciences. In fact, if my memory serves me right, 7 presidents of the American Historical Association in the post-war era were former OSS members. And the joke in the CIA is that nobody ever leaves the CIA. So former is a bit of a euphemism. It means that you're an intelligence operator and you have contacts to the bourgeois state. So that is an important context, I think, to understand. The other thing that I would say is that you shouldn't get hung up on the CIA. It's like, you know, as soon as you bring it up, people, even people in the know, it will evoke a whole series of connotations. There's a lot of other agencies involved in this type of work. Not only the intelligence agencies, but also the private intelligence agencies and a lot of other various governmental agencies. And the central goal of the CIA is to internationalize capitalist social relations. And if they do it through the stick, or more perhaps appropriately, the gun, or they do it through the carrot of propaganda and through the carrot of the mind management of global humanity, the objective is the same, right? So the CIA is not the real story. The real story is who they're working for, right? They work for the capitalist ruling class and they work for bourgeois states in order to manage the global population. Ralph McGee, I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce his last name, but he was in the CIA for 25 years, and he said that the central function of the CIA is global disinformation. Right? That's why I think this organization is important and understudied. And so that's one of the reasons that I kind of turned to and began investigating some of the work that they were doing, in part because I kept coming across references to work that they were doing. And some of my early work looked at the rise of American art in the post-war era and why the center of cultural production shifted from Paris to New York City. And there's a lot of great work on this. Why did the abstract expressionists and the pop artists and all these people become so famous? Well, the Central Intelligence Agency was actually really deeply involved in promoting it. And they worked with the private museums in the United States. They pour funds into supporting US culture because part of the goal was they didn't want the global population to think that the Americans were crass and that they were just chewing bubble gum and smoking cigarettes and, you know, drinking Coca-Cola. They wanted the global message to be, they're reading Faulkner and going to see Jackson Pollock. They're a sophisticated, I mean, it's basically like Imperial Rome, right? They wanted to project an image of imperial power that wasn't just Walt Disney and like crass base culture, and so they funded and supported it. And that was one of my kind of gateway drugs into this world. And then I began to discover how much they were involved in the intellectual world. In fact, according to the Church Committee report in 1975, the CIA was involved with thousands of academics at hundreds of universities. This is a quote. Right? That is an enormous, enormous operation. The deeper you dig into this, though, the more complicated it becomes, because I found out that the person who wrote the Church Committee report himself was CIA, and the report was vetted by the CIA, and that the exploration of both the academics and the journalists, because there's an inordinate number of journalists who are CIA, was cut short because the people who were investigating in this congressional investigation began to discover, wow, there's a lot going on here in the university and the journalistic world, so they cut it off and said, okay, we'll do what's called a limited hangout. Limited hangout in intelligence parlance is you give people a little bit of something so that you can then control the narrative, right? So that was kind of part of the background, and then maybe one of the other things that's important for the work that I'm doing now is that unlike a kind of standard image that some people have of the CIA, where you know somebody come with a briefcase full of cash and leave it in a professor's office, and then the professor's going to write some really crass propaganda or whatnot. That does happen, and I've seen a lot of examples of that happening. But it actually mainly functions differently, and that is that they control the apparatus of intellectual production. The entire system of production, circulation, and consumption is not just, controlled directly by the CIA or something like that, but they have a hand in so many different aspects of it, along with a lot of other agencies and along with the foundations, Ford, Rockefeller, Carnegie, etc., which are basically, their ways of managing capitalist wealth for intellectual and cultural propaganda. And if you look at the history of these foundations, as I have, they work hand in glove, right? So the Ford Foundation has a CIA liaison. You look at the history of who worked for the Ford and who worked for CIA, they go back and forth. These are hand in glove operations. Rockefeller's the same. Nelson Rockefeller himself was a super coordinator of US intelligence and oversaw the CIA, which was an intelligence and propaganda organization for all of Latin America. And so we have to see the kind of larger picture and not think, oh, there's the private world over here where there's the capitalists and then there's the public world. This is liberal mythology. They work really, really hand in glove. And so I guess connecting this to some of the theoretical elements, I began to ask really basic questions like, well, why was some curious, farm boy from Kansas like myself drawn to Paris and French theory? Like, how did that happen? What were the kind of systemic coordinates that put me on that particular path? And I looked into the history of French theory, its reception in the United States. And I always knew, oh, there's this famous conference in 1966 at Johns Hopkins where they brought over French structuralism. And many people have written that this was the grand arrival of French theory. And I began to look at, well, who was invited and who was paying for this? Right? Really basic material questions, which I think we should always ask. Well, the people who were invited were not people like Louis Althusser, because he was a member of the Communist Party. So he was a Marxist and he was a persona non grata in the kind of, the remnants of the McCarthy era US political orientation. So there weren't Marxists who were invited, with the potential exception of Lucien Goldman, who's a debatable figure. So there's already a filtering, right? It's the kind of transatlantic translation regime make sure that the people who are circulating are the people who should be circulating. So Derrida, Deleuze, Lacan, people like this. And it was the Ford Foundation who invested millions of dollars in this conference and then a series of publications and other conferences related to it that brought this phenomenon. And knowing more about the history of the Ford Foundation and the type of cultural production, they were interested in the promotion of intellectual anti-communism globally, right? And that was part of the project. The piece, if you had time to read it, on the Frankfurt School also looks a lot into this, right? Where was their funding coming from? It was a capitalist ruling class. Why was the capitalist ruling class doing this? They say it, like I quoted in the article, they funded them because they were towing the line that they wanted major intellectuals who were radicals to toe, in particular doing things like Horkheimer did, supporting the US imperial intervention in Vietnam, or the French, British, and Israeli imperialist intervention in Egypt, right? They were doing the good work that the capitalists and imperialists wanted them to do. And so we have to think of this dialectically, right? It's not, and unfortunately there's been some slander campaigns, unsurprisingly, against me. It's not that there are, these intellectuals who are just, getting cash and then like writing what they should write and things like this. Instead, there's a phenomenon of uplift. And if I think about it in these terms, the intellectual apparatus, this entire system of production, circulation, and reception, which is a big part of the superstructure within capitalist societies, has an enormous amount of control. And within that, if you want to climb your way up, you're an undergraduate, you want to go to grad school, you want to go to postdoc, you want to maybe get a job, maybe you want to get a job at a prestigious university, we all know how to do that. You do not do that by becoming, a specialist in Thomas Sankara. You do not do that by, trafficking in ideas that are linked to transforming the world. The way you do that is you give to the intellectual apparatus what it wants. And there's a kind of suction that is like uplift. And the more you give the system what it wants, the higher you'll rise within that system. And again, I have trouble being so self-deprecating at times because I'm like, oh, we tried so hard to do well. But I suffered from this enormously, right? The reason I got a job is because I was hired as a French theorist and I translated Rancière into English. And doing that meant that I was invited to junkets and I got keynotes and people were like, wanted to cozy up with me. I was feeling important and I was feeling relevant because I was doing radical theory, right? So it hasn't served me well to understand better how that system works and think, I don't want uplift in a system like that. I don't want to be contributing to that type of overall orientation. This is not research that I found on Wikipedia or that was on some blog. I've done an unbelievable number of Freedom of Information Act requests to get internal documents that aren't available, but that are now, some of them are available as part of the public record. I've done interviews, I've done archival research. I've actually, of course, read a lot on the history of the intelligence agencies and things like this. So the things I'm about ready to say that might be surprising are based on verifiable facts. And often, what I do is I always, cross-reference and compare and contrast. And so a lot of what I'm going to tell you is it's straight from the horse's mouth. These are intelligence operatives in MI6, CIA, FBI, etc., who have admitted what they were doing. And there are two organizations, at least, that I think should be on everybody's radar. One is the Information Research Department. The Information Research Department, or the IRD. This was set up by the British Foreign Office. It worked with MI6. MI6 is just the kind of CIA equivalent, more or less, within British intelligence. And it later worked closely with the Central Intelligence Agency. The role of the IRD was set up in 1948 by the Labour government, right? By the Labour government. Actually, well, I'll get into that in a second, because it's important that it was a Labour government. It is an international anti-communist propaganda research center that's secret, private, and has had unbelievably far-reaching consequences. It has contacts with newspapers and magazines and news agencies, and it runs publishing houses. It had its own publishing house. It worked with academic institutions, radio stations, regularly collaborated with the BBC, with London Press Service, with Reuters. It placed its people in the media and in the academic world. This is a quote, just to sum up. This is by Hugh Wilford, who has done some good scholarship on this. He says, by 1950, the IRD had succeeded in establishing permanent channels for the routine transmission of its by now considerable output of anti-communist propaganda all over the world. Right? So they have a global network of anti-communist propaganda. Does anyone know the story of George Orwell and his communist list? Right? He released a list of 135 suspected communists to the IRD. Right? He was in direct contact with a woman who worked for the IRD. He's a snitch. He gave them information on people that he thought were communists, and the IRD had an enormous hand in making George Orwell what he is today, and why I read him in high school in rural Kansas, because they translated him into at least 20 different languages. They created an animated version of Animal Farm. They collaborated with the CIA on a feature-length film based on the same book. And they worked with intellectuals like Bertrand Russell, Arthur Koestler, Milosz, Kravchenko, many others, and many of the leading specialists, quote unquote, in the history of the Soviet Union were IRD. They worked with the IRD and in certain cases published books in which they took IRD files, put them in their own name, and then published them. In particular, Robert Conquest's book, The Great Terror, Stalin's Purge of the 30s, drew extensively on IRD files. David Barzilay, the Oxford historian A.J.P. Taylor, Leonard Shapiro at the London School of Economics, Brian Crozier. The list is actually extraordinary when you go into it. And this made me think, when I came across this information, it's like, oh, that's why I thought that it was, the Soviet Union was just blood and terror and horror, and because they're pumping this stuff out, and it's given academic credentials. It's quite smart when you think about it, right? The way they've done the operation, because and they knew it, right? They couldn't just pump it out in pure propaganda and right-wing outlets. They wanted academic credentials, and they wanted in particular to work with academics and intellectuals who had some left-wing credibility. And in particular, those who were communist dissidents, those who had lost the quote-unquote faith, as if communism was a faith as opposed to like an orientation that you would believe in because it makes sense or something like that, right? It's just that's a form of liberal projection in many ways. So that's an important organization. The other organization is the Congress for Cultural Freedom, the CCF. The Congress for Cultural Freedom is a CIA-front organization whose power arguably exceeded that of the IRD. It picked up on a lot of the work of the IRD. The IRD, the numbers they had about 400 to 600 full-time propagandists working for it. Right? Think about that for a second. What do we got, like 35 people here in the room? Imagine if we had 200 or 400 to 600, and we had full-time funding, and the only thing we did was anti-communist propaganda, right? And we just pumped it out, pumped it out, pumped it out. That's an enormous amount of resources, right, in the intellectual apparatus. The Congress for Cultural Freedom far surpassed that. It was established in 1950. It had offices in some 35 countries. It mobilized an army of 280 employees, and it supported some 50 prestigious journals around the world. So it ran Encounter magazine, the Paris Review, Der Monat in Germany, Preuve in Paris, Quest in India, many others. It published at least 170 books. It ran Forum Service, which broadcast free of charge and all over the world reports from its intellectuals in 12 different languages. It reached 600 newspapers and 5 million readers, right? Enormous operation. It was blown, the cover was blown by Ramparts magazine in 1966, investigative journalists who revealed that it was a CIA front organization, run by Michael Josselson. It was headquartered in Paris, and Michael Josselson was CIA, and he referred to the Congress for Cultural Freedom as our big family, right? It was kind of like a mafia, right? Our big family had a budget in 1966 of $2 million, which is the equivalent today of $18 million, right? And what's surprising, maybe, is that this was only a very small part of what Frank Wisner of the CIA called the mighty wurlitzer. Wurlitzer was a kind of jukebox, and so he wanted and established a system by which, in Langley, Virginia, at CIA headquarters, he could press a button on the jukebox or on the Wurlitzer and have the same story play worldwide. I wasn't necessarily shocked, but I was flabbergasted by the lockstep of the global corporate media when it was decided that the COVID crisis wasn't going to be solved and that we were going to pivot to war in Ukraine, war against Russia, war against China. That corporate infrastructure is still very, very prevalent. And I could come back to this, but the CIA employed minimum 400 journalists, but it's most likely much, much more than that. It depends on what different accounts you look at. This is Carl Bernstein's account in the mid-70s, I believe. They also work hand in glove with the New York Times, with all of the major corporate media outlets. Cooper, what's his name? Anderson Cooper, interned with the CIA. Carlson Tucker apparently tried to get a job with the CIA. Apparently it didn't work out, but of course Tucker Carlson is like William F. Buckley Jr. He gives to the system what it wants. It's almost, people like that you don't need to employ them, because they're already doing the work that you want them to do. And there's much more that I could say about this because there are other levels to this. It goes much, much deeper, but I just bring all of that in because part of the agenda in the intellectual world war was not to fight a crass right-wing war against the socialist alternative. The real goal was to split the left by shoring up what they call the compatible left. And the compatible left can be liberals, social democrats, Trotskyists, Maoists, anarchists, as long as, and that's the fundamental dividing line, as long as they're opposed to any and all forms of actually existing socialism. Meaning, as long as they say at the end of the day there is no alternative to capitalism, they're part of the compatible left. And so the agenda was to shore up the compatible left, sever it from the non-compatible left, the socialist left, and particularly the revolutionary socialist left, but even not revolutionary, but just those who would support socialism, and to completely discredit and destroy the socialist left. So one of the things that's flabbergasting, finally answering your question, sorry for the detour, is that in 1966, it was revealed, and you can look at the global press at that point in time, that the Congress for Cultural Freedom was this enormous global propaganda organization that all of these intellectuals were involved. Raymond Aron, A-R-O-N, not necessarily very well known in the United States, but one of the very visible philosophers in France who wrote, is it the Opium, what's the title of the book? The Opium of the Intellectuals, I think it is. He's just anti-communist creed after anti-communist creed. Personal friend of Henry Kissinger, and he was the face of the Congress for Cultural Freedom. Right? He was also someone who was very important because he was the mentor to a lot of people in the French intelligentsia at that point in time, played an enormous role within French social sciences. Hannah Arendt had ties in various ways to both the intelligence services in Great Britain and to the New York intellectuals. Sidney Hook and James Burnham were philosophy professors at NYU, but they moonlighted as CIA. And so the number of intellectuals who were involved was quite extensive. Horkheimer went to CIA conferences, Congress for Cultural Freedom conferences. You look at the conference lineup, and they're all the kind of rat libs of the day, right? And so that blew up. And there's not a single reference in any of the figures that I've studied in German critical theory or French so-called critical theory that so much as reference its existence. Not a word. Absolute silence. Right? And these are people who literally were at the same institution, studied at the same institute, studied with these people, often published with them, or themselves were involved in these jobs. Right? And so that, to me, communicated very clearly that this modality of so-called critical theory has its limits. And one of the fundamental limits is that it's incapable of criticizing the very institutions or the very intellectual apparatus that has promoted it as the best commodity on the market, right? And so if, just as a quick counterfactual, like imagine if in one of Foucault's seminars, there was one session where he said, oh, there's a Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was a CIA front organization, and all these French intellectuals were involved in it, and this is what the microphysics of power looks like. This is how institutions control and manage minds. Everybody who's involved in the intelligentsia in some capacity would have caught wind of it. And you listening to me now, you wouldn't be surprised. You'd be like, oh yeah, he's rehashing that thing about Foucault that we all learned about like a long time ago, right? But in my case, the fact that I'm one of the, there are others, of course, one of the people who's bringing this to the fore, reveals to me it's, I think, less interesting from a kind of subjective level than an objective level. What does this demonstrate about how this intellectual apparatus works and what the limits of critique are within that intellectual apparatus? And the limits, I think, are really clear. And then the other thing that I'll add to this, just the political horizons then become very clear, right? Because people like Adorno and Horkheimer, they were very critical of capitalism and consumer society and have written some very good things on that. Critique of the culture industry and various modes of analysis of how desire and need is constructed by capitalist social relations and consumerism. There are resources, within the Frankfurt School that I've read extensively and learned from. But as bad as capitalism is, the alternative is much, much worse. And so the heinous, racist things that they say about the Soviets, about the Chinese, about the Koreans, about the Vietnamese, about Latin Americans, they don't even talk about Cuba. Adorno's family kind of went through Cuba, but there's no reference whatsoever to the first major socialist revolution within the Western Hemisphere. And so it began to make me think a little bit differently about what this radical theory was that I was attracted to, and I thought, oh, okay, this is the compatible left. And then you start to connect the dots, and it all makes sense, right? Because when you think, and we could cycle back and should to like Zizek and Badiou would be interesting, because I studied with Badiou and I've read a lot of Zizek, probably too much. And so they're interesting figures, because you think, well, these people are Marxists, right? Like, wow, they're like revolutionaries, and you can tell from their book covers, because there's like stuff on fire, and they're like making symbols or wearing red or whatever. But what's unique about them is that actually there's a fundamental consensus. And that fundamental consensus, there can be a little bit of wavering, and you have to look at the details. But they tend to be anti-party. They're against political organizing at a party level. Parties are bad. Parties are bad because when you're in a party, then you're organized in such a way that you, like, the rank and file is disciplined by leadership. And there's a focal point and modes of organizing that are hierarchical, that are top-down, et cetera, which I'll just say as a side note is a complete misrepresentation of how parties actually work, particularly good parties. But we could come back to that if you want. The other thing is they're anti-state. They're against, they're all for forms of resistance that do not succeed. As long as you're struggling and getting crushed, they'll support you. They'll say, yeah, we are, some of them, it depends, of course, we have to look at the individual cases, but most of them will be like, yeah, we're in support of the Palestinian people. If the Palestinian people establish a socialist state, I don't think they'd be saying the same thing. In fact, I'm certain they wouldn't be saying the same thing because it's not what they say about Cuba, it's not what they say about Nicaragua, it's not what they say about China, it's not on and on and on, right? Which is not to say, of course, I would never advocate for a kind of blind engagement where you just say, well, everything that is a state that presents itself as socialist should just be like blindly supported, or it means that it's absolutely perfect, or anything like that. On the contrary, I believe in a kind of dialectics of socialism, where you have to look at all of the nuances and analyze them. But these people, these radical theorists on the compatible left, they don't do that. And in fact, one of the other amazing features of almost every single one of them is that they'll go on at length about how you cannot whisper in a hallway the slightest critique of Adorno, unless you slept in his archive, read the personal letter that he sent to you on his deathbed, and learned all of the things that he himself studied, on and on and on. You can't be critical. But when it comes to actually existing socialism, not only can you be critical, you can be critical without ever having studied any aspect of it whatsoever. So people that I studied with, for the most part, they don't know anything about what's going on in the places that I've just named. They've never studied them seriously. Usually they don't have the language skills to do it anyway. They don't care. And they just say, it's all to be condemned, it's awful, and it's horrible, right? And so what that is just a kind of ideological moral reflex that's ascientific, that's lacking in rigor, and that was also highly politically suspect. Because if there's a real problem with socialism, then let's figure out what it is. Let's study it, right? Let's figure out what's working and what's not working. And so that overall consensus within the compatible left, I think, is precisely why they've been shored up. And so the most famous Marxists in the world today are famous within the capitalist world. And they're famous for a reason. They're famous because they toe the line that needs to be toed. And that is that as bad as capitalism is, the alternative is much, much worse. And so what is to be done? The answer to Lenin's question, nothing at all, but read my books, right? And I can explain to you how horrible capitalism is and how we shouldn't be organized and shouldn't get involved in any way, shape, or form in supporting projects that might, if we studied them, be leveraging power away from global capital, right? So it's a defeatist politics. It's a defeatist politics through and through. And of course, there are different versions of this, right? I'll just give a quick shout out to my man Zizek, because he came out, I mentioned this in French, but people might not have gotten it. He, of course, said that we should vote for Donald Trump in the most recent election. And his justification for that was, you might think, oh, he's a Marxist accelerationist, right? We vote for Trump, and it gets really bad, and then it's going to catapult the revolution. But no, hear me out. The reason we should vote for Trump is because that's going to force the Democratic Party to get really radical. And then the Democratic Party is going to, like, say this or something? I don't know. Like, he doesn't know anything about the history of the Democratic Party. And these myths have been going on again and again and again. Like, people are saying this about Reagan, people are saying, like, just know your history, right? So there are just the basic coordinates that should have been clear. Those who had so much egg on their face that they couldn't deny it anymore, for the most part would say, well, I never wrote anything, I was never forced to write anything. right? Which is a really interesting response because it reveals their kind of liberal ideology, and that is that the presumption would be that it's a relationship between the freedom of the individual and some, structural determinant that's going to force you to do something. That's not how this works. The reason you got money is because you were freely and willingly towing the line. And so it's not about being controlled. They choose the people who they fund and support, and they have been remarkably consistent, right? I don't know, Patrice Lumumba didn't get a check from the CIA, and lots of other examples. And so those have been the main reactions. Working backwards, as far as the second question is concerned, there are so many internal documents from the Central Intelligence Agency and other agencies that I've looked at that say very explicitly the most important battle is the battle for hearts and minds. It's interesting, right? It is more difficult to slaughter people than to control them through their minds. Because if you slaughter people, you have to dispense those resources, you get blowback, people get angry, their children get armed and try to kill you, right? And so that's one of the reasons that this Ralph McGee, the CIA officer, says that's the central function, is the role, the battle for hearts and minds. And so I think both of your questions are, well, what is to be done about it given the context that we're in? And I do think that it's important to recognize that there is an institutional setting that has a certain amount of inertia. The US political culture, where I principally teach, is reactionary through and through. It's, I think, the most reactionary political culture, definitely in the modern world, but potentially in the history of the world. There might be some other, comparables, but what that means is that you have to deal with that particular context, but also find ways of connecting people to bring them in. And at least in my own teaching, one of the principal ways of doing that is begin by simply saying, let's be open-minded about things. Let's actually investigate what's going on in the world. Let's not start with the presumption that there are things that we can't read. Let's share information, be open, investigate, and then maybe we'll be critical in various ways. And so I think you're absolutely right that we have to teach alternative lineages. And that's what I do regularly myself, and that those lineages, I think that there are intellectual lineages related to those who are developing intellectual tools to understand and transform the world, right? The historical materialist tradition is one of those, one of the principal ones. There are others as well that I also teach because I think people should know about them, various indigenous struggles, anarchist struggles, and other such things. But there's also just liberation struggles straight up, right? To find out, well, how did the Burkina Faso people liberate themselves from French colonialism? What did that look like? Most people don't know the name, don't know where the country is. So we can start from a presumed ignorance because one of the things, maybe summing this up is I try to teach what I wasn't taught. I was never taught about liberation struggles. I was never taught about historical materialism. I was taught about the canonical history of Western metaphysics. And, I guess I know that stuff really well, but it doesn't seem really helpful for the state that we're in. Right? We're in a world in which there's greater socioeconomic inequality than ever in the history of humanity, and we're facing an ecological crisis where the UN is now saying that human distinction is on the horizon. The stakes are very high. I can't read and reread Leibniz in that situation. I've got to teach things that are liberation struggle and intellectual tools that will help us liberate. And so as far as specific names go, and there's a lot of them, Claudia Jones, Thomas Sankara, who I mentioned before, Ho Chi Minh, incredible writer. I'd look at Ernesto Che Guevara. I would look at Jose Carlos Mariátegui. I would look at, there's many, Vilma Espín. There's many people that I could think of, but the people who have been invested in human liberation and who have been developing theoretical tools for us to understand what human liberation looks like. And we don't read them because we're just gonna take what they said and apply it to our circumstances or think it's absolutely right and 100%. We're gonna read them because we want knowledge that has use value, because we want to save humanity and hopefully planet Earth and the greater natural world. Regarding the first question, and of course cycle back if I haven't answered these, or we can continue the conversation. I will say just a quick note on Zizek, because I was the same way, right? That was my gateway drug to, I never read him in school, but I remember somebody saying when he published his very first book, Looking Awry, hey, this is this new thing, and I read it, and I thought, wow, this is hot, this is really interesting, and it was a gateway to a certain form of Marxism that was fun, it was cool, it was interesting, it was radical chic. It wasn't like the, stereotype of the 75-year-old, like, white male socialist who's, like, on a pedestal, standing up on a soapbox on the corner, right? And that said, like, there can be value in that, that can bring people in, but we also have to identify it for what it is. And Slavoj Žižek is the court jester of capitalism who has made a mockery of Marxism. That is his global social function. The guy is a joke, right? And he's meant to be a joke. He tells funny jokes sometimes, I'll give it to him, right? Definitely, much more entertaining than a lot of other people, although he goes on at length. And he's incoherent. But he is giving an image of Marxism that is laughable. It's buffoonery. And that's why the capitalist ruling class supports him, because he's the jester. He makes everybody else look bad. And anytime you bring up Marxism in a classroom setting, people are going to be like, oh yeah, I've read Zizek. It's like, no, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about materialist analysis and liberation struggles. We're not talking about, like, the Lacanian real and looking at cervexes online. Like, chill the fuck out, man. Zizek engages with ideas, and he pilfers elements from empirical reality that he situates within his intellectual framework, right? This isn't materialist analysis. The man is not looking at the system of cinematic production and who's funding what and like all of the details of the political economy and cinema. Not at all. He's watching Hitchcock, finding Lacan, and he's basically, it's a form of projection in which the philosopher projects his or her great ideas onto the empirical content, right? So the lack of materialism is a real problem in everything that he does, and it's probably Emiliano's question. The very first part of it, I like the term of exquisite left, it's fantastic. I didn't quite get some of the things regarding Chavez in Venezuela, but I do think there's a very good example of the attempt to develop alternative infrastructure in the case of Telesur. Because here you have a media platform, I think it just celebrated its 14-year anniversary or so, that is sharing information, investigative journalism, etc., that's outside of the mighty Wurlitzer. That's incredible, right? And that is also, video platforms available online and other such things. And I wasn't sure if you were alluding to other things in Venezuela, but at least that's what immediately came to mind. So I'll give a shout out to Telesur for the work that they've been doing. But more specifically, the case of identity politics and how it relates to class politics, I think that, and this overlaps with some of the things that Jennifer and Derek were talking about in the very first, or I guess second session, because I think of the first session as us drinking in the park. The identity politics, at least within the US context, really arose and became consolidated within the neoliberal conjuncture of about the 1970s to the present. And one of the things that identity politics and various forms of culturalism, because it took many different iterations and we should be able to identify them, right? It was political correctness, now it's wokeness, it goes through different iterations, but the basic beast is still the same. And that is that you replace class politics by race politics or gender politics or sexual politics, and you oppose them, right, in a very non-dialectical fashion. And then you denigrate the non-compatible left as being people who are class reductionists and have no account of race or gender or sexuality or any of these things, right? And so it's really putting forth identity and culturalism as the primary focal point for your politics. And anybody who spent any time in an American classroom knows this, right? You always have to announce the point from which you're speaking, and you're always talking about what your various identities are, or inventing new identities in order to be able to use them in the kind of marketplace of identities. And what that does politically is a number of things. One is that it completely divides and separates the working and toiling masses. Because instead of us sharing in common, what we all share in common, and that is that we have to work to survive. Like, we don't have gardens we can live off, like in the feudal era, and unless you're a trust fund baby, you're probably gonna have to get a job, right? Meaning that you're a member of the global proletariat in the very precise sense of the term. You do not have the means of subsistence. You have to work for someone else. You have to sell your labor power. That we all have, and is a very clear basis for politics and for identifying the fundamental undergirding problem in the contemporary world, and that is that our labor power is producing value that's being siphoned off and taken from us by parasites who are the ruling class. Instead of, in the case of socialism, taking that value and redistributing it in the form of universal healthcare, universal education, universal housing, and a universal right to employment, as well as a focal point on the full development of human beings as cultural beings, as sexual beings, as complex beings who can do different things and are not simply reducible to their vocation or their cog within the capitalist system. And the other thing that this does is it completely erases the entire history of liberation struggles that have been inspired in various ways by Marxism, that have been at the forefront, the vanguard of struggles for racial liberation, gender and sexual liberation. And it's remarkable, but it's just part of the lingua franca of the contemporary academy. People don't know this. Valentine Moghadam has a great study of the history of revolutions where she demonstrates that the Russian Revolution was the greatest liberation of women in any moment prior to that point in time and any moment since that time. Women were integrated into leadership, women were given maternity leave, there was a socialization of care work. So you had teams of people who were workers who would clean all the houses so the women didn't have to be trapped in drudgery and didn't have to do the social reproductive labor. There were kindergartens and there were care centers that were set up in order to do that labor and to take that seriously and not just outsource it to women as domestic slaves, right? In the United States, who was at the forefront of racial liberation in the interwar period? It was the Marxists who were organizing. That's a very well documented history. It's not known, but very well documented. So these people aren't class reductionists. They're not class reductionists at all. What they do is they recognize that there's a class relationship within which there are very specific modalities of super exploitation and oppression. And if you can create an ideology that says that, well, women should not be given a wage for taking care of children and doing housework and cleaning, then you super exploit them, right? And you maintain these kind of patriarchal relationships of ownership and other such things, just as if you can create the myth that blacks are subhuman, then you can justify slavery, right? And so Emiliano's question, I think, really goes to the heart of, it's not saying, well, we need a class politics and you forget about all, race and gender and sexuality. No, class politics is a foundational and structural element for different ways in which we can struggle concretely and materially against super exploitation and oppression. This doesn't mean waving a BLM flag or speaking in certain ways. It means material change. It doesn't mean, allowing another voice in the room or only that. It means actually changing the conditions of production so that women aren't subjected to domestic slavery and racialized groups aren't subjected to super exploitation, right? That requires structural change, not gestural politics. And that's what identity politics is. It's gestural politics and it's symbolic politics that divides the working masses, and it's not by chance that it's gone hand in hand with neoliberalism, and it has a deeper history in the deep history of social chauvinism in general, because it's a way of destroying progressive organizing. Because then, as you were pointing out, instead of having a basis for our solidarity, and that is that we're all workers, and some of us have been super exploited, and some of us have been oppressed, but guess what? We're bonding together in a common struggle. We have a politics in which we're divided and fighting against each other, and saying that the real fundamental issue is about identity, not about our common struggle for liberation, which includes racial, gender, sexual liberation, and other forms of liberation for that matter. Adorno has a complex corpus, of course, right? So there's a lot going on there. I would say that there are certain elements that I take to be the best elements in Adorno's work where he takes directly from the historical materialist tradition. His analysis of the history of sound recording and its impact on music, it's really solid and interesting historical work that provides us with some elements of a political economy, but then more specifically a materialist economy of how recordings operate, how they circulate, what their impact is on musical production. It's really interesting work. Some of the other work that he does, I think, transition more into a kind of transcendental idealism of sorts in which there's a large conceptual structure and then empirical data is just sandwiched within it. Dialectic of Enlightenment, you know, there's some insightful things in that book about the culture industry and other such things. There are also unbelievable abstractions that are kind of laughable from a historical point of view. They're just, you know, yeah, they're so conceptually abstract that they're that I don't find them particularly helpful. And I would also say that within a book like Dialectics of Enlightenment and some of his other work, he traffics in a lot of enforced obscurantism. And one of the problems with a lot of radical theorists is that there's the assumption that the more difficult it is to understand your discourse, the smarter it is. When in fact, it's often the opposite. The clearer that you are in elucidating something means that you actually want to communicate, connect with people, share resources with them, be part of a collective project. That's being intelligent, if by intelligence we mean working on a collective project and elucidating the world so that we can gain a grip over it. I think you're right that in many ways, the positive claims, I mean, Adorno basically doesn't have any. He says that only despair can save us, you know, again and again and again. Some of the negative claims I think are helpful, right? They're good, you know, some of them are good critiques of consumer society. Jennifer and I on Wednesday are going to talk about aesthetics, and I do have a lot of problems with the larger aesthetic project that Adorno has for a number of reasons, one of which is that he basically defines aesthetics in terms of bourgeois aesthetics, even though at times he says he doesn't. If you look at his theoretical practice, what is he analyzing? He's analyzing bourgeois aesthetics. He's not looking at, like, quote-unquote folk culture, at, you know, dance practices. He's looking at the performances for the bourgeoisie of dance and music and art and things like this. And so there's an assumption that is highly problematic, and that is what counts as art is bourgeois art. Not culture writ large. Mary Louise Pratt, I'm sure we'll touch on this as well. Not the culture that we make, right? But the culture that's elevated above people like us and that is institutionalized and is part of the bourgeois project of adorning itself and making it look like Imperial Rome because, and so when you take those horizons as the horizons of art, you are basically being a bourgeois philosopher of art who's shoring up and protecting bourgeois art, and moreover, making a very incorrect assumption, and that is that there's a magical relationship between this bourgeois art and social transformation. And the causal linkages can never be explained because there are none, because it's mystical thinking, it's superstition.
Examination that surrounded the discussion from both sides. I think that has a lot to do with what Isabella was saying.
Yeah. Really great and interesting questions. I'm going to do my best. I might start kind of at the end and work back. I think it's really important not to fetishize anything. Just as I was saying, you know, don't fetishize Derrida or Paul de Man. You also shouldn't fetishize particular liberation struggles or particular figures. Like, we're human beings and we're trying to figure stuff out, but just as we shouldn't fetishize our own parents, we should recognize they're human beings, right? They're kind of messed up too, and they messed us up, and we're kind of just dealing with it in various ways. And the other thing that I would say in a less anecdotal fashion is that critique and self-critique is the lifeblood of the left. The right doesn't do this. They don't subject themselves to self-critique. And by right, I have a pretty expansive notion of the right that includes a lot of just pro-capitalist, right? I'm not just talking about like extreme right. They don't, you know, announce, mea culpa, we messed up. We're gonna really change our politics. We're gonna shift things considerably. No, but the left does. And that's actually one of the single most important things is a collective tradition of self-critique in which we remain open to those critiques, we take them seriously, and it's not simply theoretical. We change our practices, right? And I could give lots of examples of this. We actually talked about gender and sexuality. There's lots of critiques of Cuba in the 60s and 70s for their position on gender and sexuality. What did they do? And there were problems. They should be pointed out. They should be highlighted. We should know about what those problems were, where they came from as well, right? Because they also came from the deep history of machismo within Latin America, and a lot of them predated the Cuban Revolution. But through a process of self-critique, they transformed quite considerably the institutional apparatus for supporting LGBTQ folks, for also educating the general population. They just were working on the new family code, and the new family code has a very expansive notion, and it's a family code based on, input from the entire society, a very expansive notion of what a family is that's largely self-defined as opposed to being the bourgeois nuclear family with domestic slavery and other such things. So that's just one example of the importance of self-critique. And the other question more about intellectuals, it's true that people like Lukács or Gramsci in the early 20th century, they were involved in political organizing very explicitly, and Gramsci spent most of his life in prison because of that. A lot of the later intelligentsia within the Western world was not, and they were severed from it in various ways, either willfully or, in many cases it was willful. And so I take it that some of the other questions, both of the questions have to do with, well, how do we situate ourselves in these landscapes, and what do we do as intellectuals and within the theoretical world? I do think there's an enormous power to theory. I could quote someone like Lenin who said that, there is not practice without theory. We all have theories of how the world works and what we're supposed to do to change it. But what we need to do is develop better, more coherent, more theories that also have more leverage, are able to really latch onto the world and change it in significant ways. And in my experience at least, and this might be where we have slightly different vantage points, I think that some of the theorists that we're talking about, I always have what I would call a variegated hermeneutics. I don't just read somebody and say, well, it's all crap or it's all fantastic, right? Just as we shouldn't fetishize anything, we also shouldn't say, in certain cases, like Henry Kissinger, I don't think has a lot of good stuff going on. But there are people who, as I was saying about Adorno, I've learned some things from him. I've learned some things from reading Bolivar. I've even learned some things from reading Derrida, even though I think his politics are bad, and I think that he's a poor reader in certain instances. And so with bourgeois cultural production, and it's also a problem really there's a big debate within the Cuban history about, well, what do we do with bourgeois cultural production? I think that you have to recognize that bourgeois cultural production is largely the result of an intellectual apparatus within the capitalist world. But what this means is that these were the people who were identified, for better or worse, as having the most potential as artists, as intellectuals, etc. They were given incredible resources to do what they were to do. And there are elements that we can take and learn from in various ways. But I think we also, dialectically, have to understand that they're also operating within a system that largely controls the parameters of what's possible. And so in pointing out the parameters of what's possible, I'm interested in intellectuals who are connected to struggles. Because the state of the world, right? I've got kids. The planet is being dissolved. Nuclear war and World War III is on the horizon. I don't think it's alarmist to say that there couldn't be a better time to connect intellectual work to practical work in a way that the Western, and it's important, it's in the Western capitalist core, has not done for a long time. Latin America has a big tradition of it. Africa has, other places have deep traditions of it, but within the capitalist core it hasn't happened as much. So I don't know if, some of these questions seem like things we might follow up on and have a further conversation about. But if I work back up, just in the interest of time, about material reality itself, I would simply say that human beings are the result of a material reality that precedes us and surpasses us. We don't know the limits of the universe. And therefore, human thought has to be understood as a product of these broader material forces. But when I say material reality, I'm not saying that like an empiricist would say. Empiricists would say, there is just this world and it is precisely this and I can objectively understand it. No, a materialist would say, there is a world out there that has formed the history of Homo sapiens and me and how I think, but the only way I can understand it is through the categories that I've inherited from my culture and my situatedness in society. And therefore, when I describe this material reality, it's dialectically mediated by my conceptual framework, right? So any empirical reality in a brute sense, I could never apprehend it because it's mediated by my sensory apparatus, by my conceptual apparatus, by the words that I have, like material reality and things like this. And that, Lenin is actually really good on describing how dialectics is, amongst other things, the process of learning from the limits of our own thought. Learning how our categories are much more limited than the infinite complexity of the empirical world. And so one thing we have to do, and this comes back to theory, is develop theoretical tools that allow us to capture better, to describe better, the material world and its infinite complexity. And by describe better, that's not just a theoretical project. It's being able to describe them in such a way that you can get a handle on them and intervene practically. If it be in a direct political sense or just more generally, like actually be able to make a table as opposed to not be able to make a table. The second thing, the different forms of information where my mind immediately went, and I see Emiliano's projected here on the screen, who's a well-known Brechtian, is to Brecht. Because when you were asking about how to share information, what we're doing here is mediated by discourse and a few hand gestures, and that's as good as we get. But communication, human communication, is so much broader than that. And we'll talk about this with aesthetics. And one of the things that's so powerful in Brecht's work is he talked about form. And the way Brecht understood form is that form is the way in which you take an understanding and you mediate it through whatever it might be. It can be language, it can be song, it can be dance, it can be performance, it can be music, in order to communicate to someone else. And the form is principally important because sometimes the best way to communicate to whomever it might be is a dance performance, is getting someone, one of the reasons that I got interested in transformative politics was getting wrapped up in the punk scene, right? The punk scene wasn't an academic lecture saying, hey dudes, we gotta be alternative. No, it was people who were stage diving and a sense that, well, we can do a different world and we don't like this other world that's very conformist, and there are limits to that, of course, but there's also the form that brings people into different ways of understanding. And so this expansive notion of form is really important. I think we'll come back to this because Jen and I have worked a lot on this in aesthetics. Conspiracy theory question is great. I will just say really quickly that the notion of conspiracy theory has been so widespread within the Western world beginning, I'll look at the precise date, since 1967, because the CIA made a very explicit decision to label as conspiracy theorists anyone who questioned the Warren Commission report on the JFK assassination, and they specifically identified that in all of their press assets, anyone who said, well, maybe JFK wasn't killed by a lone gunman would be labeled as a conspiracy theorist. So there's a weaponization of conspiracy theory in order to discredit materialist analyses of history. And I'd be happy to talk about the Kennedy assassination because there's a lot of things that people should know about it because it reveals how the US state works and who's really in control.